Richard III's name stands out in history as one of England's most controversial kings. Rising to power in 1483 after the death of his brother, King Edward IV, Richard claimed the throne in a time of chaos and uncertainty. His decision to take the crown instead of allowing his nephew, Edward V, to rule has been the subject of fierce debate ever since. His short reign, lasting just 2 years, was marked by significant events that shaped how he is remembered. Most notably, the mysterious disappearance of the two young princes, Edward V and his brother, has haunted his legacy. Many believe Richard ordered their deaths to secure his position, while others argue he was unfairly blamed, and the truth remains unclear. For centuries, Richard has been portrayed as a ruthless villain, especially in popular culture, thanks in part to Shakespeare's famous play. Yet some historians now challenge that view, suggesting he may have been a capable ruler whose legacy was tarnished by the Tudors who came after him. Was Richard III truly a power-hungry tyrant, or was he misunderstood? His story continues to raise questions, and the debate over his reign remains as lively as ever. Early life and rise to power. Richard III was born on October 2, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle, Northamptonshire, to Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. He was the 11th child in a large, powerful family deeply entrenched in the political battles of the day. His birth came at a time when England was divided by a long and bloody conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. This series of civil wars, fought between the houses of Lancaster and York, would shape Richard's life and set the stage for his eventual rise to power. Richard's father, the Duke of York, had a strong claim to the English throne through his descent from Edward III. His family, the House of York, was locked in a fierce rivalry with the House of Lancaster, which held the crown at the time. The young Richard grew up in a period marked by shifting alliances, battles, and political intrigue, all of which would deeply influence his character and actions later in life. As the youngest son of a prominent noble family, Richard's early life was shaped by the military and political ambitions of his father and older brothers. His father, the Duke of York, was not just a powerful nobleman but also a serious contender for the throne. By the time Richard was born, the Duke of York was already positioning himself as a challenger to the reigning king, Henry VI, of the House of Lancaster. Richard's upbringing was heavily influenced by the turbulent times. His early years were spent at his family's estates, but he quickly became aware of the dangers of the political climate. By the time Richard was 8 years old, the Wars of the Roses had already begun. His father, along with his elder brothers, Edward and George, were actively involved in the conflict, fighting to claim the throne for the House of York. In 1460, when Richard was just 8 years old, his father was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, along with one of his older brothers, Edmund, Earl of Rutland. The Yorkist cause seemed to be in jeopardy, but Richard's eldest brother, Edward, soon took charge. Just a few months after their father's death, Edward won a decisive victory at the Battle of Towton. And by 1461, he had been crowned King Edward IV. This marked the beginning of the Yorkist rule, with Richard's older brother on the throne. As Richard grew older, he began to play a more active role in the ongoing Wars of the Roses. Despite his youth, he was trusted with significant military responsibilities. When he was just 17, Richard was appointed as the Duke of Gloucester, a title that came with great prestige and power. As Duke, he became one of his brother Edward IV's most loyal supporters and played a crucial role in the Yorkist military campaigns. Richard fought in several key battles during the latter stages of the Wars of the Roses. He gained a reputation as a brave and skilled soldier, often fighting alongside his brother, the king. His loyalty to Edward was unwavering, and he proved himself a capable commander. One of his most notable contributions was at the Battle of Barnet in 1471, where the Yorkists secured a decisive victory against the Lancastrians, further solidifying Edward's hold on the throne. During this period, Richard was also granted extensive lands and titles, further increasing his power and influence. As Duke of Gloucester, he was given control of the northern regions of England, where he established himself as a powerful lord. His administration in the north was efficient, and he was known for maintaining law and order in the region, gaining the respect of many of his subjects. Richard's loyalty to his brother, King Edward IV, was one of the defining features of his early life. While other members of their family, such as their brother George, Duke of Clarence, were known for shifting allegiances and political scheming, Richard remained steadfast in his support of Edward. This loyalty was rewarded with land, titles, and military command, all of which helped Richard build a strong power base in the north of England. Edward IV's reign was marked by both triumphs and challenges. After his initial success in claiming the throne, Edward faced opposition from several factions, including his own brother George, who at one point allied with the Lancastrians in an attempt to seize the throne for himself. Through all of this turmoil, Richard remained loyal to Edward, often serving as his trusted commander in military campaigns and as a key advisor in political matters. Edward's reign was relatively stable by the 1470s, but it was not without its difficulties. He faced rebellions and uprisings, particularly from the Lancastrian supporters who continued to resist Yorkist rule. Richard played a key role in quelling these uprisings, using his military skill and authority in the north to keep the region under control. One of Richard's most significant roles during Edward's reign was his involvement in the suppression of a rebellion led by Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, in the early 1470s. Richard's effective leadership in the north ensured that the rebellion was swiftly dealt with, and his actions further cemented his reputation as a capable and loyal commander. In 1483, everything changed with the sudden death of King Edward IV. Richard's brother, who had ruled England for over 2 decades, passed away unexpectedly, leaving behind a political vacuum that would soon lead to a crisis. Edward's death was a turning point in Richard's life, setting the stage for his controversial rise to power. Edward IV left behind 2 young sons, the eldest of whom, Edward V, was just 12 years old at the time. According to the late king's will, the young prince was to be crowned as the next king, with Richard, Duke of Gloucester, serving as his protector. Richard was entrusted with the responsibility of safeguarding the new king and ensuring a smooth transition of power. However, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Richard's position as protector of the realm placed him in a delicate and powerful position. As the king's uncle and a trusted military leader, he had both the authority and the resources to control the succession. However, the young Edward V and his brother, Richard, Duke of York, were under the influence of the Woodville family, a powerful and ambitious faction led by their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of Edward IV. The Woodvilles had long been a source of tension within the English court. They were seen by many as opportunistic and self-serving, and their influence over the young king alarmed Richard and his supporters. Fearing that the Woodvilles would dominate the new regime and marginalize his own power, Richard took swift action. In the weeks following Edward IV's death, Richard moved decisively to consolidate his power. He intercepted the young Edward V on his way to London for his coronation and took him into custody. The young king was placed in the Tower of London, ostensibly for his protection. But this marked the beginning of a series of events that would lead to Richard's controversial claim to the throne. Richard quickly moved against the Woodville faction, arresting key members, including Earl Rivers, the brother of Elizabeth Woodville. He declared that their influence over the young king was a threat to the stability of the realm. With the Woodvilles out of the way, Richard was able to assert control over the government and the royal council. In June 1483, a turning point came when a priest named Robert Stillington claimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. According to Stillington, Edward had been pre-contracted to another woman, meaning that his marriage to Elizabeth was not legally binding. If true, this would mean that Edward's children, including Edward V, were illegitimate and had no right to the throne. This revelation, whether true or manufactured, provided Richard with the justification he needed to claim the crown for himself. On June 26, 1483, Richard declared that the princes were illegitimate and that he was the rightful heir to the throne. He was crowned King Richard III on July 6, 1483, in Westminster Abbey. Richard's rise to power was swift, but it was also highly controversial. Many viewed his actions as a usurpation, particularly the arrest and imprisonment of his nephews. The two princes, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, were placed in the Tower of London, and they were never seen again. Their disappearance remains one of the greatest mysteries in English history, with many accusing Richard of having them murdered to secure his hold on the throne. Richard's supporters argued that his actions were necessary to prevent a Woodville-dominated regency and to maintain stability in the kingdom. They pointed to his record as a loyal and effective servant of the crown, as well as his efforts to restore order in the north of England. However, the disappearance of the princes cast a long shadow over his reign and made it difficult for him to win widespread support. Despite the controversy, Richard's reign began with a degree of optimism. He promised to be a just and fair ruler, and he took steps to reform the legal system and improve governance. However, his grip on power was fragile, and he faced growing opposition from supporters of the Lancastrian cause, who saw Henry Tudor, a distant relative of the Lancastrians, as a potential challenger to the throne. In the end, Richard III's claim to the throne would lead to further conflict, culminating in the Battle of Bosworth field in 1485, where he would face his ultimate defeat at the hands of Henry Tudor. Richard's rise to power, marked by loyalty, military prowess, and decisive actions, set the stage for one of the most debated and mysterious reigns in English history. Richard III's reign, though brief, was marked by significant events that left a lasting impact on English history. Rising to power in 1483, Richard faced numerous challenges, from opposition within the country to controversies that still remain unsolved. Despite his short time on the throne, Richard III enacted notable reforms and became one of the most debated figures in English history. After claiming the throne in June 1483, Richard moved quickly to solidify his power. He was crowned King Richard III on July 6, 1483, in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Richard knew that, as a new ruler, he had to establish his authority, not only among the nobility but also with the general population. His claim to the throne was controversial, given that it had involved declaring his nephews, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, illegitimate. This decision, which effectively disinherited the two young princes, stirred tension across England. One of Richard's priorities was to win public support. He began by presenting himself as a ruler committed to justice and good governance. His reign was marked by an effort to reform the legal system, making it more accessible to the common people. He introduced measures that allowed for legal appeals in cases of unfair treatment by the courts, especially in property disputes. He also aimed to protect the rights of landowners and tenants, ensuring that laws were applied fairly. In addition to his legal reforms, Richard III sought to maintain order and stability in a kingdom that had been torn by years of civil war. He placed loyal supporters in key positions of power and worked to suppress any potential rebellions. His reign was initially peaceful, and for a short time, it seemed as though Richard might be able to secure a stable rule. However, Richard's claim to the throne was overshadowed by one of the greatest mysteries in English history: the disappearance of his two nephews, the princes in the Tower. Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, had been placed in the Tower of London shortly after Richard III took control of the government. The Tower was a royal residence at the time, and the princes were housed there while preparations were made for Edward's coronation. But by the summer of 1483, after Richard had taken the throne, the princes were no longer seen. Rumors quickly spread that they had been murdered, and many suspected that Richard himself was responsible. Though there is no definitive evidence proving Richard's involvement in their deaths, the mystery of their disappearance has haunted his legacy for centuries. The fate of the princes remains a subject of speculation. Some theories suggest that Richard ordered their deaths to eliminate any challenge to his rule, while others argue that other political figures may have been involved. Some historians have even proposed that the boys were smuggled out of the Tower and lived in hiding. Despite extensive investigations, including the examination of remains found in the Tower in the 17th century, the true fate of the princes has never been conclusively determined. The disappearance of the princes damaged Richard's reputation, both at home and abroad. Many of his subjects were uneasy about the circumstances surrounding his rise to power, and the disappearance only fueled suspicions that he had taken the throne by dishonest and ruthless means. This contributed to a growing opposition to his rule, especially among the supporters of the rival House of Lancaster. Despite his efforts to portray himself as a fair and just king, Richard III faced considerable opposition from various factions. The most significant threat came from the supporters of Henry Tudor, a member of the House of Lancaster with a distant claim to the throne. Though Henry had spent much of his life in exile, his supporters began to rally around him as a potential challenger to Richard. In October 1483, Richard faced the first major rebellion of his reign, known as the Buckingham Rebellion. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, who had initially supported Richard's rise to power, turned against him and joined forces with those loyal to Henry Tudor. Buckingham's rebellion was fueled by dissatisfaction with Richard's rule and widespread suspicions surrounding the fate of the princes. The rebellion gained significant support, but it ultimately failed due to poor coordination and bad weather. Buckingham was captured and executed, but the rebellion demonstrated that Richard's hold on the throne was far from secure. The failure of the rebellion did not end the opposition to Richard. Throughout his reign, Henry Tudor continued to gather support, both in England and from foreign allies. Richard attempted to strengthen his position by securing alliances and placing loyal supporters in key positions. But the Lancastrian cause continued to gain momentum. Despite the turmoil and controversy, Richard III did introduce several important reforms during his reign. One of his key goals was to make the legal system more fair and accessible to ordinary people. He established the Court of Requests, which allowed poorer citizens to have their grievances heard without the need for expensive legal representation. This court was particularly useful for resolving disputes related to property and land ownership. Richard also introduced measures to regulate trade and commerce, aiming to strengthen the economy. He supported the development of industries such as wool production and tried to ensure that merchants could trade freely and fairly. Additionally, he enacted laws to protect the rights of the common people, including legislation that limited the practice of forced loans and arbitrary taxation. These reforms, though significant, were often overshadowed by the political instability that defined Richard's reign. His efforts to present himself as a reformer and protector of the common people were undermined by the ongoing suspicions surrounding his rise to power and the fate of the princes. Richard's reign came to an end on August 22, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth field. By this time, Henry Tudor had gathered a sizable army and launched an invasion of England. Richard, confident in his military abilities, personally led his forces into battle. The two armies clashed near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, in what would be one of the most important battles in English history. Despite being outnumbered, Richard fought bravely and was determined to hold on to his crown. However, the battle turned against him when key nobles, including Thomas Stanley, switched sides and joined Henry's forces. Richard's army began to collapse, and he famously charged into the thick of the battle in a last-ditch effort to kill Henry Tudor and win the day. Richard fought valiantly but was ultimately killed in the battle, the last English king to die in combat. With Richard's death, the Wars of the Roses came to an end, and Henry Tudor was crowned as King Henry VII. This marked the beginning of the Tudor dynasty and a new era in English history. Richard III's reign may have been short, but his legacy has endured for centuries. Much of this is due to the controversy surrounding his rise to power and the mystery of the princes in the Tower. Over time, Richard has been portrayed as both a villainous usurper and a misunderstood ruler who was simply trying to bring order to a divided kingdom. Richard's reputation was further shaped by William Shakespeare's play Richard III, in which he is depicted as a ruthless and power-hungry tyrant. This portrayal, though dramatic, has significantly influenced how Richard is remembered in popular culture. However, many historians have sought to re-examine Richard's reign in a more balanced light, arguing that he was a capable ruler who introduced important reforms and faced challenges beyond his control. In the centuries since his death, Richard's legacy has been the subject of ongoing debate. Some view him as a tragic figure whose reputation was unfairly tarnished by his enemies, while others maintain that he was responsible for the deaths of the princes and deserved his downfall. The discovery of Richard's remains in a Leicester car park in 2012 sparked renewed interest in his life and reign, leading to a more nuanced understanding of the man behind the myth. Richard III's brief reign was a period of great uncertainty and change in English history. His legal reforms, military prowess, and complex personality have made him a figure of enduring fascination, while the mystery of the princes in the Tower continues to capture the imagination of historians and the public alike. The Battle of Bosworth, fought on August 22, 1485, remains one of the most significant events in English history. It marked the dramatic end of Richard III's reign and the fall of the Yorkist dynasty, while simultaneously laying the foundation for the rise of the Tudor era. The consequences of this battle echoed for generations, as it signaled not only the end of the Wars of the Roses but also the beginning of a new chapter in England's history with Henry Tudor's victory. Richard III's defeat, his controversial life, and the discovery of his remains centuries later have continued to fascinate historians and the general public alike. Richard III's rise to power was marked by political intrigue and personal ambition. After the death of his brother, King Edward IV, in 1483, Richard became Lord Protector for his young nephew, Edward V. However, it was not long before Richard claimed the throne for himself, arguing that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, making the young princes illegitimate. Richard was crowned king, but this move sparked unrest. Not long after, the young princes, Edward and Richard, disappeared from the Tower of London, fueling rumors that Richard had them murdered to secure his hold on the throne. Although Richard managed to quell the early rebellion led by the Duke of Buckingham, his grip on power remained tenuous. Many nobles were uneasy with his rule, and the mysterious disappearance of the princes led to widespread mistrust. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Henry Tudor, a relatively distant relative of the Lancastrian line, was preparing his own challenge for the throne. Supported by a coalition of exiled nobles, disaffected Englishmen, and French forces, Henry sailed for England in the summer of 1485, intent on overthrowing Richard. Richard III was well aware of Henry Tudor's intentions. As soon as he learned of Henry's landing in Wales, Richard began organizing his army. Despite the growing opposition, Richard still had loyal supporters, including powerful nobles such as John Howard, Duke of Norfolk. His army was larger than Henry's, with around 10,000 men to Henry's 5,000, and he had the advantage of experience, having fought in many of the Wars of the Roses battles. Richard also knew that the Stanleys, a powerful noble family, would play a crucial role in the coming conflict. Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derby, had married Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, which made him a potential ally for the Tudor cause. However, Stanley was known for being cautious and was unwilling to commit to either side until he was sure of the outcome. Richard tried to force Stanley's loyalty by holding his son, Lord Strange, hostage. But the Stanleys remained non-committal as the armies prepared for battle. On the eve of battle, the two armies faced off near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard's forces were positioned on a slight rise, giving them the advantage of the terrain. His men were well equipped, and morale was high, as they believed they could easily crush Henry's smaller and less experienced army. Henry's forces, however, were composed of seasoned fighters, including French mercenaries and Welsh troops who had rallied to his cause. Henry himself had little military experience, but he was supported by capable commanders, such as the experienced John de Vere, Earl of Oxford. The key factor, however, remained the undecided position of the Stanleys, whose forces had camped separately and were still withholding their loyalty from both sides. The Battle of Bosworth began early in the morning on August 22, 1485. The opening exchanges were standard for the time, with both sides launching volleys of arrows and cannon fire. Richard's forces held the high ground, giving them an early advantage as they watched Henry's troops advance. Henry, understanding that his forces were outnumbered, adopted a defensive strategy, aiming to stretch the battle until Stanley's forces could tip the balance in his favor. As the two armies clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat, Richard's position initially seemed secure. His infantry, consisting of both professional soldiers and local levies, pressed the attack on Henry's forces. The Yorkist cavalry, led by Richard himself, remained in reserve, waiting for the right moment to strike. However, the Stanleys' forces continued to stay out of the fray, watching from a distance as both sides battled fiercely. Richard, growing increasingly frustrated with their inactivity, sent orders for Stanley to commit his troops. But Stanley refused, fearing for his son's life but unwilling to back Richard outright. The turning point of the battle came when Henry, realizing that the tide was not turning in his favor, decided to take a bold risk. He moved his command closer to the battlefield, hoping to rally his troops and signal the Stanleys to intervene. Seeing this movement, Richard III recognized an opportunity. If he could kill Henry Tudor himself, the battle, and the rebellion, would be over. In one of the most famous moments of the battle, Richard led a direct cavalry charge towards Henry's position, hoping to reach him and finish the battle in one decisive blow. Richard's personal courage and military skill were on full display as he fought his way through Henry's bodyguards, killing several of them and coming within striking distance of Henry himself. However, at this critical moment, the Stanleys made their choice. Rather than standing by, they threw their forces into the battle, on Henry's side. Thomas Stanley's intervention shifted the balance decisively. Richard's forces, already heavily engaged with Henry's troops, were now surrounded. And Richard himself was isolated in the thick of the fighting. Realizing that his cause was lost, Richard fought to the end. Accounts from the time describe his fierce resistance as he tried to break free, but he was eventually overwhelmed. Knocked from his horse, Richard III was killed in the midst of the battlefield. His death marked the end of the battle and the collapse of the Yorkist resistance. Richard's death was significant for several reasons. Not only was he the last English king to die in battle, but his defeat also marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty. His crown was retrieved from the battlefield and placed on Henry Tudor's head, signaling the start of a new era in English history, the Tudor dynasty. Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth was the turning point that led to his becoming King Henry VII. His reign would last 24 years, and during that time, he worked tirelessly to solidify his claim to the throne and bring stability to a kingdom that had been torn apart by civil war. One of his first acts was to marry Elizabeth of York, Richard III's niece, uniting the houses of Lancaster and York and symbolically ending the Wars of the Roses. This union produced the Tudor Rose, a new symbol that combined the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. Henry faced challenges during his reign, including rebellions and pretenders to the throne. But he successfully established the Tudor dynasty, which would go on to rule England for over a century. His reign laid the foundations for the future successes of the Tudor monarchs, particularly his son, Henry VIII, and his granddaughter, Elizabeth I. Richard III's death at Bosworth marked the end of his controversial reign, but his legacy would continue to be debated for centuries. For many, Richard was a villain, the man responsible for the deaths of his nephews, the princes in the Tower, and a usurper who stole the throne through treachery. This negative image was cemented by William Shakespeare's portrayal of Richard as a deformed, power-hungry tyrant in his play Richard III. Shakespeare's depiction of Richard as a Machiavellian villain, scheming and ruthless in his pursuit of power, shaped public perceptions for centuries. However, in recent years, there has been a growing movement to reassess Richard III's legacy. Many historians argue that Richard was a capable and effective ruler who implemented important reforms during his brief reign. These included reforms to the legal system and measures to protect the rights of landowners. His supporters claim that much of the negative portrayal of Richard was Tudor propaganda, designed to justify Henry VII's seizure of the throne. The most significant event in the re-evaluation of Richard's legacy came in 2012 when archaeologists from the University of Leicester discovered his remains buried beneath a car park in Leicester. This discovery was remarkable, as Richard's burial site had been lost for centuries, and the recovery of his skeleton allowed historians and scientists to learn more about the man behind the legend. Understanding Richard III's story means looking at all sides of his life and reign. From his rise to power and the battles he fought, to the mystery surrounding his death and the rediscovery of his remains, there's much to consider. Different perspectives show Richard as both a controversial figure and a capable ruler. By examining these different viewpoints, we can better understand the complex history of this monarch. So, take a closer look at the various aspects of Richard III's life and legacy. Whether you're interested in his role in the Wars of the Roses, the dramatic events of his reign, or the recent findings about his remains, there's a lot to uncover and think about. With that said, thanks for watching. And until next time.